Silent Hill F is a brand new entry into the Silent Hill franchise with a new setting, new developer, new characters, and new theming. It's fresh and visually gorgeous when you get down to it, but it's also another Unreal Engine 5 game from Konami, an engine and publisher combination that has meant troublesome performance in the not-too-distant past. At least that's what we thought until recently, as my friend and colleague John Linneman made a video covering a Gamescom demo of this game with a lot of positive things to say. So how does it shake out here for the game's final release on PC? Do our demo impressions hold true? Has Konami tamed Unreal Engine 5? Let's find out by talking about that first play experience on PC. When loading up Silent Hill F on PC the first time, there's those usual splash screens and then a shader pre-compilation step. When I first saw this, I was of course happy, as it is always good to see, but I was soon somewhat confounded. The shader pre-comp step was only 30 seconds long on a Ryzen 7 9800X3D and a little more than double that on a Ryzen 5 3600. A game with AAA graphics and art on an engine that is known to create tons and tons of shader variants, yet here the game was spending relatively short amount of time pre-caching those shaders on PC. As you can imagine, I was a bit worried that the game would then miss shader variants and subsequently have shader compilation stutter while playing. Getting in game on the Ryzen 7 9800X3D with an RTX 5090 at the epic settings of 4K DLSS performance mode, my initial 15 minutes of play were fine enough. Surprisingly smooth for a modern Unreal Engine game in my experience, but in those first 15 minutes of play, I was mainly nonchalantly exploring the initial staging area, taking in the scenery, not seeing anything new, nor was I traversing great distances to show off traversal stuttering issues that could potentially be there. After those first 15 minutes were up though, I dared to stop daddling and push to the next area. The intro is linear, mind you, so you kind of have to go forward to progress the game. Then, after a short cutscene, I hit my first big one. A frame time spike that was nearly 300 milliseconds in length on a 9800X3D. The spike totally cast me out of the otherwise immersive and arresting audio-visual experience and reminded me that, yep, this is an Unreal Engine game on PC, and here we go again. 6 years of me explicitly talking about shader compilation stutter on this channel, and, well, I get this. As you can imagine, I was less than thrilled. Well, if the spike was this length on a 9800X3D, how long would it be on a lower end CPU, like a Ryzen 5 3600, a CPU that is between the minimum and recommended specs here? Now, for this gameplay you're seeing on this CPU-GPU combination, I purposefully turned down a number of GPU-related settings to ensure that the frame rate graph we'd be looking at was clean of dips related to the GPU, so please excuse those potato-looking graphics here. Anyway, pushing past the intro area to get to the place with the big spike was easy enough, and the Ryzen 5 3600 just barely managed to creak through that sequence with a 500 millisecond hitch, followed by an extended sequence of CPU-limited dips below 60, and then a final 200 millisecond hitch. This behavior is of course poorer than we saw on the 9800X3D, but it's also different in a way in how it manifests, and that goes a long way to explaining how and why the developers of this game only had such a short pre-compilation step in the game's first load. But before I get to that, let me first prove that we're talking about a shader compilation issue. Running through that same area again on the Ryzen 5 3600 at the same settings shows much improved performance. Instead of big frame time spikes that are almost half a second in length, we see a smaller 50 millisecond hitch with some drop frames, as well as one 100 millisecond hitch. The performance is so different the second time because all of the shaders for this scene have already been compiled the last time we ran through here. The stutters that we're now seeing in the second time we play it are just traversal stutters. Same thing on a Ryzen 7 9800X3D. Instead of a 300 millisecond hitch here, we see merely a 33 millisecond hitch, as all of the shaders have already been compiled the last time we ran through here. That little 33 millisecond hitch is just a traversal stutter. So yep, this is definitely a shader compilation issue. But why did the 3600 also have this extended CPU limited frame rate drops after the hitch was done, and the 9800X3D did not have that behavior? The reason for that is because alongside missing key shaders in its precompile step, this title additionally uses asynchronous shader compilation with visibility skipping. But unfortunately for the player, the developers are using this technology incorrectly. For one, asynchronous shader compilation is causing extended frame rate drops on lower end hardware, like the 3600 here, while it is churning away on shaders asynchronously in the background. This can be found multiple times in the game's intro with big frame rate drops sometimes, like after this cutscene, but more commonly it's like this. You run forward and you see a smattering of poor frame times which cause momentary dips in the FPS, and during that time you'll see the CPU spike up to 100% as shaders are being compiled asynchronously in the background. The second time you run through that area though, you might only see a single frame time drop, or none at all. This behavior of the game running better a second time through is because shaders are being compiled asynchronously, and it's depressing performance. Why should the game run worse the first time you play it? Does that really make sense to you? Here, the developers ought to just add a bit more time to the precompile time in the game's first load up instead of making the game run worse the first time you play it. A game only has one time to make a first impression, and this game is doing a bad job at it at the moment on PC. Another reason why I would contend the developers are using asynchronous shader compilation incorrectly is because they are using it to compile shaders that are immediately viewable and key to the game's visuals in the first moments of the game. They are leaning on asynchronous shader compilation instead of using it as a technology to help round off a game's shader compilation strategy for those straggler shaders that are harder to get at. A good example of this is right at the game's intro. On a big PC with a fast CPU like the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, you start up the game and you see the first in-game real-time rendered cutscene. A great and emotional scene that is just a bit lessened by the fact that your character arms pop in a bit late on PC due to the skin shader being asynchronously compiled. But it's not the worst thing on this huge CPU. On a lower end CPU, like the Ryzen 5 3600, the scene is almost comical as it takes 5 seconds for the character hands to pop in holding the toy. Why are the developers leaving such a critical shader, like the skin shader, that you see in the very first shot of the game out of the precompile sequence? It is immersion breaking in a game that I think would otherwise be so incredibly immersive if they just had a different shader compilation strategy. So here I suggest to the developers to have a much more complete version of the shader precompilation step that actually covers a playthrough of the game, as it currently is quite obvious that it does not. The game would look better, it would look smoother, and it would be great on the first playthrough, whereas right now it's kind of awkward. I might be sounding a bit harsh here by pointing this out so strongly, but they could easily multiply the length of the shader precompilation step many times over, and it would be a huge boon to the player. I'm rather confused at the moment that they did not view their current strategy as problematic, given how blatant the issues can be, especially on lower end hardware. As you may have noticed in the last section, beyond shader compilation stutter, the game does have traversal stutter. Of course, it is a bit challenging to separate the two of them, as when a traversal boundary is hit, it can tend to stream in new shaders for compilation for the first time when you traverse an area. Based upon second time playthroughs though, traversal stutters on the Ryzen 7 9800X3D can be somewhat smoothed over with a 60 FPS cap, but will occasionally show up with small frame time blips above that cap, and of course animation stuttering on traversal boundaries like almost any Unreal Engine game. On a lower end CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600, when the game is uncapped, it is actually dangerously close to being below 60 FPS by itself anyway in denser areas of the game. The frame time spikes on traversal there will be between 33 and 50 milliseconds typically, with some occasional larger ones. Traversal stutters are found throughout the gameplay experience and increase, I would say, the further you get into the game. Here in a side-by-side, we can see that the 9800X3D's traversal stutters are roughly half the length of those found on the Ryzen 5 3600, even though the frame rate advantage of that 9800X3D is 2.5x. As mentioned, no platform can escape these stutters. In the end here, my first play review of this game lends a very different impression than what John related to us in his Gamescom PC demo. If I had to guess, his demo already had the shader cache warmed up by previous playthroughs. and it was on a powerful CPU with this frame rate cap to help mitigate traversal stutter issues, thus making them less apparent. The reality is, though, that the first time playthrough of Silent Hill F is not smooth enough for my standards, and even if you just count shader compilation issues, it still has traversal stutters in those areas where shaders have already been compiled, and this becomes more apparent the further you are in the game and the more mainstream your hardware is. So no, Konami has not tamed Unreal Engine here. Now let us move on to optimized settings and start rounding off this video. Optimized settings in this game are simple enough as they follow the mostly just use high motto that comes with standard Unreal Engine 5, but with a few differences. Let us first start with the global illumination, where you have three settings: epic, high, and off. You can just write off unless you're playing the games on a potato or Steam Deck. Between epic and high, you will see a bit more light leak, as we can see in the fog in the door frame here on high, but the performance win is, as usual, too hard to pass up on lower end hardware like the RTX 4060 here. 14% here in this shot, but it will depend on the scene. In other scenes, this can mean slightly less accurate indirect shadows under foliage or opaque objects, but I think high is worth it for optimized settings. Next up is reflections, here with 4 presets. Off is once again absolute Potatoville. Here the settings controls the quality of SDFs that lumen reflections trace against, being ever so slightly better on epic than on high, with a very small 3% performance win for high. Turning on SSR over high is barely better, as the game does not have a lot of complex reflections to make this a real performance win. Given the lack of reflections in this game and how it uses diffuse to specular hacks in Lumen GI, I recommend the high setting here for optimized settings. With shadow quality, we see the first deviation from my usual blanket high. Here, as per usual, high degrades VSM quality for a 10% performance win, but in this game, the medium setting also has a meaningful performance win of 15%. Low turns off shadows completely and is of course not worth it. Here I say lower end GPUs can get away with medium with little problem, with just a few occasional softer shadows close to the camera, which are not too bad in this third-person game. Now the shader quality setting here does something different than usual. Usually this would change lumen's roughness cutoff for reflections like in many titles, but here it doesn't appear to do that. Rather, it changes the distance at which vegetation stops moving. Most likely they do this due to particularities of how virtual shadow maps work. This can have an intense performance win depending upon the area you are in, but it'll vary heavily based upon where your screen is pointing. Here it is hard to give numbers owing to that variance, but here I find the high setting a good balance for optimization, as medium flips that animation too close to the camera and low essentially turns it off altogether. The last setting you might want to worry about for optimized settings is the visual effects quality setting. Here in most scenes, you would struggle to see what it is doing, with minor increases to performance with each preset downward. Only when you get into larger open scenes with fog can you see how it is affecting the game's signature fog look, turning off that rolling ground fog for a minor performance bump at high and minimizing the rest of the fog greatly on low. Here I recommend the very high setting to keep the game's signature look intact. There are other settings in there, of course, that are less important for optimization, like the view detail setting, which only seems to do something when set to low, getting rid of geometric objects at a distance for little to no performance win on a low-end GPU like this. I imagine this is meant for Steam Deck-like devices, so keep this at very high. In the end, optimized settings will look like this: something set to medium, something set to high, but with very little visual degradation for doing so. When compared side by side in an average gameplay scene with tons of fog in it, you can see something like a 50% performance uplift with minuscule visual quality differences. In other scenes with more visible objects or shadows, you will see a greater visual difference that is noticeable in side by sides, but will be well worth the performance uplift, which will be above 50%, almost 60% at times. As with many UE5 games, native resolution is not going to be worth it for optimized settings. Here, using optimized settings at 1080p DLAA increases performance over the max by 48%. But you can instead use something like 1440p DLSS quality mode, which has a lower internal resolution and hence runs 65% better than 1080p native very high, and it will also have better image quality due to outputting at a higher res, so definitely use image reconstruction. The last recommendation I have is related to the texture setting. Here, make sure you use the high setting if you are on an 8GB GPU and not the very high setting. The very high setting with 8 GB will incur extra long stutters at world boundaries that just will not be there at lower settings. This minorly changes the texture streaming cache and does not have a major impact on image quality. With that being said, I'm at the end of this video here. There are, of course, a few other things that I hope change in patches, like the 30 FPS cutscenes that I haven't really talked about, but the biggest issue in Silent Hill F at the moment is the shader compilation strategy chosen by the developers. They really do need a longer pre-compilation step with more combinations in there, including various graphical settings combinations. That would prevent this game from having a worse first-time experience of play like it currently does. It is currently leaning too heavily on asynchronous compilation, and this is a mistake, as that makes the game have noticeably worse frame times and frame rates on mid to low-end CPUs, and it will produce graphical errors, like you can see here, where post-processing related shaders being asynchronously compiled breaks image reconstruction momentarily, and it leads to visuals like this. That is not how you are supposed to use asynchronous shader compilation. If you ignore shader compilation issues, we actually have a game here that scales well on the GPU with optimized settings and would run well enough minus traversal stutters. Regarding those traversal stutters, they are definitely there, and I find them annoying. If you can ignore them, more power to you, but I really can't as a tech reviewer. They are typically smaller than those found in Silent Hill 2, for example, but I just wish they were not there. It's funny how we have this game with fog thicker than a Nintendo 64 game, but it still loads things in this chunky way that causes big frame time spikes. Why not load stuff in a more gradual way so as to prevent that? It's not like the user could see through that fog to notice a gradual load. Like with Chronos A New Dawn though, I have trouble completely faulting the developer here for the traversal stutter situation. Unreal Engine, quite seriously, has traversal stutters in nearly every game on every platform, consoles included, and apparently this will only be really fixed in the future based upon work that CD Projekt Red has done. Either way, if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help on Patreon. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.